programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are back for another episode of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution.radio. I'm your host, Diamond, from the Oppenheimer Ranch Project. My lovely co-host and partner in crime, Leah Shaper, is joining us.
Hello.
Welcome to the show. Today, we're going to be talking about multiple topics, but we're going to keep on the climate change narrative because we like to get the UN moniker below our videos.
Yeah. And hopefully we don't get demonetized.
Yeah, we have been retroactively demonetized for several videos due to new policies that are being enforced haphazardly by YouTube and other platforms.
Mm-hmm.
So let's first talk about something that we forgot to talk about last week, and that is the bumper that happens during this radio show and the concept of freedom of speech. Would you like to touch on that a little?
Yeah, a lot of viewers and listeners have commented on the Brian Ruse bumper because of the, I'll just say, unusual perspective about Adolf Hitler. And while we do not agree with Brian Ruse's opinion, we do very much support freedom of speech. And what freedom of speech means is that you have to tolerate hearing about opinions that you don't like. Just because there is a bumper in our show for Brian Ruse's bumper during our show doesn't mean that we are associated with him, but it does mean that we support Revolution Radio because they are a freedom of speech platform. So for us to leave this platform because of that bumper would essentially mean that we don't support freedom of speech. So I actually think it's quite important that we stay here on this platform rather than run away because we're worried about what people think about our association with that kind of opinion. So
Excellent.
That's my rant.
Yeah, and more importantly, you're also assuming that you know everything about everything when you make decisions like that.
Sure.
I mean, sure. I don't like anything the mainstream media has to say about catastrophic climate change and the doom and gloom. Mm-hmm. But it's there,
yeah.
Not because it's true.
Right. And even when something, let's say, is completely factually incorrect, there may even still be some elements that are worth listening to just for food for thought, know, or for ways that you can sort of counteract an incorrect narrative or whatever it may be.
I almost had a Mike Pence moment. There was a fly about to land on me. So let's dive into the show, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to be setting the record straight on polar bears because some more nonsense is coming out about the catastrophic climate change and the demise of penguins.
Yeah.
We're also going to set the record straight on wildfires, worldwide data, local data, and the fact that the mainstream media has been lying not only about polar bears and penguins, but also wildfires, which are in recent weeks have mostly been set by people.
Yeah, and sometimes
negligence.
And sometimes lightning.
And then, if we have enough time in the second half, we're going to talk about global warming, volcanoes, and the truth about CO2, that it lags temperature by about 800 years. So temperature is driving the CO2, not the other way around. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about that show?
I think that's a good lineup.
All right. Can you see the screen?
Yes. I love
Trust
this cartoon.
Science is the most anti-science statement ever made. In fact, it is questioning the science, which is how you do science. So when you get a theory like the anthropogenic global warming theory, you would then test the models. And in the last 30 years, the models have been tested. They're off by factors of up to 500%. So we can conclude from that the anthropogenic global warming model is probably bad and needs to be reworked, but they haven't done that. They just
Mhm.
keep pushing the narrative, saying that the science is settled.
Mhm.
Yeah. When there, in fact, is not a single paper that can show you that carbon dioxide is warming Earth.
I'll throw out there too that this cartoon alludes to a larger trend that has been going on for all of my lifetime that I can remember, because I used to comment about this even when I was a teenager. It's this idea that there are like the experts and that you should never question them. You should never ask questions or raise criticism or whatever. And it's like this process we learned this in school where they say, it's funny, they say, and it's like, okay, well, who's they? And can I ask questions about this? Can I launch some criticisms? And you see it in the way that people interact with the healthcare environment. They go to their doctor and then they just do whatever their doctor said because their doctor said it. And it's like, okay, well, what if your doctor's wrong? Like I'm one of those patients who's really annoying. And when I go to a doctor, I ask a lot of questions. I do my own research. I raise issues. And I'd say 90% of the time, they can't answer my questions, which makes me worried. I don't believe in just trusting the expert just because they're supposedly some expert, which is like deemed by who and what? Experts can't make mistakes. It doesn't make any sense. And I think it's a really unhealthy way of going about things.
Yeah, it's frightening when doctors know less than you do about something.
Yeah.
Especially when you're trying to go get some help.
Right. And it's like, and they might even specialize in that thing. And then here I am, I've spent 3 hours doing some research and they can't answer my questions. And it's like, what the heck? Anyway, just blindly trusting experts is a really poor idea, which is essentially, what this comes out of. And it's been around for decades. And a lot of people have lived their life that way, that they don't ask questions and they just trust the experts.
They told us DDT was safe and kids used to play in the fog.
Right.
That was incorrect. Thalidomide, that's safe. Right?
Well, weirdly, this is a whole other conversation. Weirdly about thalidomide, aside from specific trimesters of pregnancy, thalidomide actually is very safe, but it's very dangerous during those particular pregnancy trimesters. But that's a whole other conversation.
Right. And then we have vaccines and other drugs that have killed people that were improperly made with improper. They told us plastics were safe, and now we know otherwise. The entire world is polluted forever with PFAS. They told us a lot of things, and now they're telling us that cobalt mining is going to save the world.
Right. Which is extremely dirty, which essentially abuses children working in those mines. And it's like, oh, that's what you want? The green energy movement people, liberals of the world, you want children to be abused in mines being polluted at the same time? It's disgusting.
Yep. Well, let's dive right into the narrative, the anti-narrative from the mainstream media. These journalists are so complicit and they're just propagandists. And we know this because years after studying the articles coming out, it's very clear that none of these journalists are doing any fact checking.
No, not at all.
On any of these topics.
No, it's completely embarrassing. I don't understand how you write and put things out in the world and you don't have like the smallest bit of integrity to spend an hour just doing a little bit of looking around.
Right. There's not a single journalist that's writing about any of these fires worldwide, whether they be Canada, Maui, Greece, anywhere, that is within the breadth of the article explaining that even though these fires are catastrophic, overall worldwide burn acreage is at an all-time low, which is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, not a single one is mentioning that. And the data was coming out as early as 2017 here. You can see this paper, Human-Driven Decline in Global Burned Area. This has to do with more firefighters, better logistics, better fire management and forest management. And when you look at the data, it's clear. When you look at the short-term data, here we're looking at estimated annual carbon emissions from wildland fires from 2003 to present, and you can see a decrease in the annual carbon emissions. Now, does that mean there's less fires? Yes. The global burned area since 2003 has decreased by a huge margin, almost It looks like here over 20%.
Yeah.
So global burned acreage is very low. Now, this graph, mind you, just goes to 2015, so we can look at some other data sets. The first one, which is the most telling, which is has the highest resolution data for any of the data sets, is the U.S. burn area. We have very good data that goes back until the mid-1920s, and here you're looking at that data. And the irony of all of this is that 2023, so far in the U.S., is the top 3 lowest burn areas ever recorded in history.
Yeah. It's kind of amazing.
The Maui fire, which no one even understands is a tiny, minuscule fire compared to anything happening in Canada.
Right. Well, and this graph doesn't show this, but it does suggest as well the connection between high rates of wildfire and, let's say, drought and warm periods, right? Like, look at what's happening in the 1930s era when it was extremely hot and dry in the United States and we had the Dust Bowl. We had a lot of wildfires. I mean, we're not looking at those two data sets on top of each other, but it does suggest that this is probably cyclic with cyclic changes in our climate. And again, it has nothing to do with anthropogenic global warming.
Right. And the spike here during the global warming, during natural climate variability on Earth, which, peaked recently. The reason these numbers might be lower is because we have millions of firefighters on Earth.
Right.
We have tens of thousands in the U.S., and there were none back here in the 30s in these regions. There were very few people that were, brigades fighting fires. They were just allowed to burn.
Well, not to mention much better technology, right? Like in the 1930s, I don't think you had helicopters dumping fire suppression material over forest fires.
Right. And there was no one spotting them so that they could put them out early.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So overall, you can see there's an exponential decrease in burn acreage worldwide, especially in the U.S., with 2023 being one of the most tame wildfire seasons ever on record.
Yeah.
So the conclusion is that the world is burning less, much less.
A lot less.
Right. So here we're looking at 2000 to present. There is a huge reduction from 3% of global land area burned back in 2000. We are all the way down to 2.2%. That's massive. That's like a 33% reduction worldwide in burned land area.
Mm-hmm.
Massive.
Mm-hmm.
And so with all this data that is available to anyone at their fingertips with a short stint at research, and even Google will give you this information. You would think that they would have hidden it all by now.
Yeah, and this is not hard to do. I was thinking about this earlier because I was reading an article you sent me, and it was very easy to, I come across these little paragraphs where they state some supposed fact, and then I go look it up, and either the fact is wrong or they're making it sound like something terrible when in reality it's completely normal. So it's very easy even for the average person to even just check if something that's being claimed to be out of the ordinary to see if it really is, because often it's not.
Yes,
the way the mainstream media has been working.
I agree. Do you have any other final thoughts on the climate change narrative and wildfires?
Well, I mean, just that it's obviously part of the whole hysteria that's being pushed particularly hard right now. I'm thinking about the UN representative. I don't know what his position was, that was saying, oh, it's not global warming, it's global boiling. I mean, it's so incredibly sensational and false. It's just ridiculous. I mean, and at this point, I think the only people that's going to impact are people who are already fully brainwashed and already hysterical about a bunch of other things. I'm seeing more and more people listen to statements like that and recognize that it's hysteria because it doesn't match with their real world experience.
Yeah, there's so many people commenting below many of the videos that we produce, you and I, or that I'm producing about climate change. And the people are so angry, and their response is like, "Have you seen the whole world is burning up because of the brainwashing on wildfires?" When if they took 5 seconds and looked at this, I think that if you showed those type of people this graph, they would say this is made up by someone paid for by the oil and gas industry.
Oh yeah. Yeah, because it's not only that they're at a point where they're unable, and I'm talking about super brainwashed people, where they're unable to see information that shows the opposite of what they believe. They're unable to absorb that, but they're also unable to even take their real world experience and contrast it with what they're being told, or think about how it might be different somewhere else. And maybe they're like, I'm thinking about an old friend of mine from back east who has been absolutely hysterical about climate change, and claims that it's 120 degrees out all the time, and she has to hang blankets in her windows, and it's unlivable. And it's like, even her description of her own experience seems really, really, really extreme and unrealistic. But she's also unable to think like, okay, well, if I lived in, I don't know, Minnesota, it might be completely different, and what I'm experiencing may not represent what's happening in other parts of the world.
Yeah, especially if you live in a desert or like Southern California, where it's often 120 degrees.
Yeah, and this is somebody from Southern California. So.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
So let's jump in to the second topic, which is the fraud that's being perpetrated now. In the opening, we talked about how decades ago, starting as early as the 70s or the beginning of the global warming scare, which would be early 80s, they used polar bears as a tactic. But just the other day here, the British Antarctic Survey published this article: loss of sea ice causes catastrophic breeding failure for emperor penguins. Now, a couple things we'll first start off here with talking about the polar bear lie. Polar bear populations, in fact, are booming regardless of the global warming hysteria and all of the headlines. It's very hard to find a headline like this that has the truth in it, but somehow the Las Vegas Review-Journal nailed it.
Yeah.
It's the only one I could find. But if you look at, there are plenty of polar bear scientists, over a dozen well-known scientists, and they've been doing higher and higher resolution studies since the fake polar bear scare started decades ago. And polar bear populations have increased from an initial 12,000 polar bears to what is expected to be, some say, 26,500 or more. That is a significant
amazing
increase in what is that, 6 decades?
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. It's really amazing. And it's even more extraordinary to me that, look at the decade 1980 to 1990, because I feel like that was when the polar bear narrative really, really started. I don't know if that's accurate enough. That's just my perception historically, that, the polar bears are all disappearing, and they were increasing even then. I mean, that's amazing.
In the 80s and 90s, there was already double the initial population in just a few decades. So they were literally lying through their teeth.
Yep.
All right, so let's see what they're saying about penguins now. They're saying that emperor penguin colonies experience unprecedented breeding failure in a region of Antarctica where there was a total sea ice loss in 2022. Now, in many regions of Antarctica, there is total sea ice loss. And here you can see that penguin colony and then the loss of sea ice as you move into summer. But what happens in Antarctica is that the sea ice comes back every year, year after year in the winter. So a couple of things you should note from this is that penguins experience sea ice loss every summer. Mm-hmm. And they've been experiencing sea ice loss. Man, this is a tongue twister. Where is it? Yeah. Sea ice loss every summer since satellite records have been kept. Mm-hmm. I have a graph up here that you can't see on the radio, but trust me when I say, going back to, let's say, 1986, when they turned the satellites on, green is Antarctic sea ice. And you can see that there is no trend. This is the maximum up here and the minimum down here in the green. And you can see that there's like a decadal cycle where it goes up and down. See how that ebbs and flows like that?
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the peak, the most Antarctic ice ever in recorded history since we've recorded it was in 2013, which is just 10 years ago. And they want you to believe that somehow Antarctica is catastrophically melting and is going to, destroy the planet when there is zero evidence. We're looking at the long-term ice core data here, and there is very little change in the Arctic ice in purple, as you can see.
Well, we're looking at the sea ice extent. I'm just correcting your misspeak there. But
did I say volume?
You said ice core.
Oh,
ice core
okay.
data.
Sea ice extent. Yeah.
Anyway, so
sea data of the ice
extent.
sheet itself.
What?
This is the actual data of the ice sheet from satellites.
Yeah. It's remarkably flat, right? I mean, is there oscillation? Yeah, there's a little, but the overall trend is as flat as it could possibly be. And of course, if you look at sea ice extent for Antarctica for this year versus whatever it is, the last 30 or so, yeah, it is lower. And there has been a downtrend over the last 3 years. But you see the same thing happening at a different time in the Arctic sea ice extent. And so there's clearly an oscillation. Like you said, there are periods where it drops off and we kind of have less and less of it, and then it comes back up again.
Yeah, you can clearly see that here around 2006. There's an Arctic ice low here in extent. See that low? It's like a U shape down when the Antarctic ice is doing the exact opposite.
Yeah, it's like a sinusoidal wave that reverses, and the Arctic versus the Antarctic, they're in the opposite positions.
Right, and the Arctic ice extent is at a 9-year high. It's been growing for almost a decade.
Right.
So we should see a decline in Antarctic ice, which we do.
Right. This is what we should see. It's totally normal. I want to throw something else out there too. That they only there's a few issues here, but they only talk about. They say that there was 100% loss of sea ice in November of 2022. But if you look, which fair enough, if all of this is correct, some of the facts in here, they talk about that the penguins don't fledge, meaning they don't start swimming until December or January. They don't get the feathers that they need to swim in the ocean until December or January. So if you lose all the sea ice in November, okay, yeah, that may be a problem. However, I'm all over the place here now, but again, part of a cyclic thing, populations of animals rise and fall naturally with the cyclic changes that we do see in climate. It doesn't mean that it's a catastrophe. But the other thing is when they say 100% loss of sea ice in November of 2022, they are only talking about one specific area of the coastline, which is right about where your cursor was below the peninsula there. There's that Bay Area. It's just that area. That's if you divided Antarctica up into 12, that's one rotationally, that's one section. It's 1/12. It's not all of Antarctica. There are other emperor penguins that live elsewhere in Antarctica.
Yeah, and the bad news that the media didn't do is they didn't do any fact checking. And that it's very difficult for all kind of penguins to survive. Yeah. In fact, king penguins can typically have, this is crazy, up to 50% of all chicks may starve during winter. That's just one variety of penguin.
You mean emperor penguins, right?
What?
Emperor penguins, correct?
That was king penguins.
Oh, okay.
Emperor penguins are worse off. They may experience a 90% mortality within the first year of their life. So on average, only 10% of all born emperor penguins make it in a bad year. Yeah.
Yes. And that was the other point I wanted to raise. Essentially what you're saying here is and this article that we were just looking at even references this, that there's actually not a whole lot of factors that lead to the demise of a penguin population. Obviously, there's some amount of predation, but the largest factor in their population numbers is changes in the sea ice. And frankly, We need that. I'm sorry to say, but every animal population has something that controls their population from growing out of control, right? Like here in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado, we have loads and loads and loads of mule deer and elk. And if those numbers were to grow unchecked, it would be completely insane. There wouldn't be enough for them to eat. Well, thankfully, we have mountain lions that keep that population in check.
Yep. Oh, beautiful. And with that, in the second half, we'll talk about global warming volcanoes.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Who owns you? If you're not in control, then someone else is. Join me, Ivy West, for Voices on the Wind, Saturday. I discuss government, health, metaphysics, suppressed science, universal mysteries, little-known incredible facts, alternative energies, and even more than you can imagine.
There was blood on the wire.
Won't you join us on Revolution Radio Saturdays for Voices on the Wind with me, Ivy West.
There are lives in the balance, people under fire, children at the cannons.
Because if your head's in the sand, your tail is a target.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported radio station on the internet. Please help support this station so this battle can continue forward. Revolution Radio!
The Secret Kindergarten is here for the young children of the world. The best program on the radio for kids, dealing with the most important topics in the whole universe. Fairy tales, music and movement, numbers, plants, animals, fun, colors, insects. Take care and cast your ears out to catch a story from the world of other young things. Reach out, up, under, and over. Sing a song. Talk about feelings. Just remember the magic word. The magic word is no. Step on into the Secret Kindergarten. Saturdays, 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern Time, right here on Revolution Radio.
Join me on the Brian Rouge Show on Revolution Radio, Eastern Standard Time, every Tuesday night from 6 to 8. We talk about the four most vital things, in my view, affecting all of humanity. Number one is UFOs and aliens and their agenda for the advancement of humanity. Number two is the Jewish establishment's control over all aspects of human civilization. Number three, the truth about Adolf Hitler, how he was the opposite of what we've been told. Number four is advanced ancient global civilizations. Join me on the Brian Rouge Show, Tuesday nights from 6 to 8 on Studio B on Revolution Radio.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. Any commercial advertising you may hear in this program is of the sole discretion and benefit of the host of whose program you are listening to. Revolution Radio does not endorse any commercial products, nor does it accept monetary compensation for on-air advertising of commercial products, nor will it ever. We are and shall remain 100% listener supported. Any product advertising on this program are considered used at higher risk, and Revolution Radio shall not be held liable for any claims or damages received from any product advertised within this program. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps. The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
And we're back for the second half of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution.radio, the #1 listener-supported internet radio. So please become a Patreon. Just go over to Revolution.radio. When the page comes up, go right up at the top and says donate, become a Patreon. You can also go to Revolution.radio every Saturday at noon and click on that Studio B button to listen. We also replay the show. Go ahead.
That's what I was going to say, what you're saying right now. Go ahead.
That we replay the show over at Magnetic Reversal News in the evening at 8 p.m. Mountain Time. So you can see the graphics and some of the data that we pull up.
Speaking of graphics, I just want to mention one other point about this silly article about the penguins. It's very funny. They talk about, over the past 7 years, the sea ice around Antarctica has decreased significantly, blah, 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 blah. And then they talk about, they say, and the sea ice this year didn't start to reform until late April 2023. Right below that is a graph of Antarctic sea ice that basically shows that the ice is really just starting to reform in late April all the time.
Yeah.
It's just an example of like how a journalist can put out a statement like that and make it sound like it's something sensational and a problem. And then you go actually look at the data and it's like, oh, that's actually completely normal. That's sort of what I was referencing earlier in the show.
Yeah. And none of this disinformation is a good thing. Based on a lot of the research I've done, I believe that we know about Just Stop Oil, these delusional climate change activists that destroy things for no purpose, that actually cause more harm to the earth. I mean, and there's one group, 2 girls epoxied their hands to a runway. I think one of them had to get their hand amputated.
That was potentially the consequence, that she was going to have an amputation because it was friggin' epoxy. It wasn't like super glue or something. Yeah, you're really intelligent. We're
not talking about this sharpest tools in the shed here. Now, what that results in is things like Just Stop Oil, these crazy activists doing nonsensical things that don't amount to anything. But what if there are now hundreds of crazy leftists that are lighting wildfires?
Right. And that's possible given what we've seen of the mindset of people who are hysterical about this.
Yeah. So I shared this the other night. This is 1 day old. The Greece wildfires were being blamed on climate change ad nauseum, and then 79 people were arrested for arson. And after I reported on that, there were people commenting, but that doesn't mean they lit the fires.
That's what arson is. What are they talking about?
These climate activists are so delusional, they don't believe 1 and 1 is 2 because it's 3 or you're a racist.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that's pretty alarming about this is that it's 79 people. Was this a group of people that were suspected to be behind the arson? Or is this like 79 different people independently going out and saying, I think I'll start a wildfire because climate change? That's a lot of people. That's alarming.
They just refer to them as arsonist scum. Greece has called out arsonist scum after police make 79 arrests over wildfires ravaging the country. At least 20 people dead this week. You are committing a crime against the country, Mr. Kilkali said. Arsonist scum are setting fires, threatening forests, property, and most of all, human lives. That was in a briefing on Thursday. You will not get away with it. We will find you. You will be held accountable. And it's easy to tattle on these people because anyone that watches them doing it, I mean, you're probably lighting their town on fire. So they're going to tell on you.
Right. Right. I mean, and then, even if it's not arson, we've talked about and mentioned, several other causes of wildfires, including human arson, but also being careless, right? Which is actually pretty easy to do. Like I was getting upset at a neighbor recently who, during a very dry period in our area, had like campfires, and it's like, this is not the time to have a campfire. And they just seem to be like unaware or not caring about how dry it is. Something like that can easily start a wildfire.
Well, the majority of fires here are from out-of-state people doing careless things at campsites.
Yeah, and this, in fact, was out-of-state people who happen to have property
Yep.
here, but don't pay attention to the conditions.
So the Antarctic doesn't have a lot less sea ice than usual. And this is an example of cherry picking again. We showed you the graph that the maximum ever recorded in Antarctica was in 2013.
Mm-hmm.
So in the next 10 years after the maximum, what is the only thing that can happen? There has to be less.
There can only be a minimum.
So they always start, and like in the article, you said that the sea ice has been declining for 7 years or whatever. Yeah, since the highest ever recorded.
Right. Which is, again, completely normal. It's part of that normal oscillation. There are years where the Antarctic sea ice decreases, and at the same time, the Arctic ice increases, and vice versa.
Yeah, and at the middle of winter here, a paper last week was describing wide swaths of ice-free Antarctica. which might have been referring to the summer, but at the time that they were talking about it, the entire continent is covered with like 100 miles or more of ice in every direction.
Right.
And all you have to do is search. This is like the #1 global warming site where I got this from, the NSIDC.
Mm-hmm.
This is where they show you the actual data, but in the write-ups tell you that the world is melting.
Well, it's hilarious too, right? Because they give you that yellow line that we're looking at, or I'm sorry for our audio-only listeners that you can't see that right now. But there's a yellow line around Antarctica that represents the median ice edge from 1981 to 2010. And then you look at the ice coverage superimposed on it, current, and it's really not that different.
No, in some areas it's much larger.
Right.
In some areas it's slightly smaller.
Right.
But overall, there's millions of square miles of ice.
Well, I mean, this is kind of a great example of like taking the data out of context. Not this picture. This picture gives you the data in context, which is why it shows that it's not really that big a deal. Oh, look, I just noticed that that yellow line, they also say this is missing. That's funny. But anyway, it shows it in context. But if you take this data and kind of cherry pick it and only show a small portion, so you're showing maybe a decline in ice over a short period of time without actually knowing what the ice extent normally is and how this doesn't vary from this all that much. It's the same thing as showing a temperature graph that only goes back to 1970 or something like that. Without the full context, it's meaningless. But they use that to scare you.
Yeah, the amount of ice loss we've seen in the last 2 years that they're claiming is catastrophic was also occurring back here in 1997.
Right.
And the maximum is where they're starting to show a decline because we had a peak here. Mm-hmm. And they are lying. It hasn't been decreasing for 7 years. It's showing that since 2020, we've had a slight decrease.
Yeah, and you can see that.
And we're not at the end of the ice extent year here on this graph, so completely delusional.
I mean, you can see that on other graphs that, compare to the median from 1980 to 2010. You can see how 2022, 2021, 2020 a little bit. It's like there's a slow decrease. But again, out of context, without knowing that there's this oscillation cycle, it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, it means they're really good at manipulating words and scaring the public with false headlines.
Yeah.
Now, how the Tonga eruption could have warmed the planet, study says. I think we touched on this.
We did.
But let's just rehash it. Typically, eruptions have a cooling effect as they release sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. For example, the largest eruption on record released enough sulfur dioxide to cool the global climate by 3 degrees C, according to volcanologist Clive Oppenheimer. I find that last name to be quite intriguing.
Yeah.
But the 2022 Hungatunga eruption is not like all eruptions. In fact, this did have a sulfur component, but the majority of eruptive material from this baby was seawater into space, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So the Hungatunga Haipai, because it did contain sulfur dioxide, I think about 400,000 something cubic kilometers. I don't know, but that's the number I remember, which is about like 1/4 of Pinatubo, which cooled the Earth 1.5 C.
Yeah.
So this was much smaller. And in fact, there was a cooling of Earth that was detected within the first year of the Hungatunga eruption.
Mm-hmm.
But the long-term effects we talked about last week is that overall global atmospheric moisture has increased by 13%, which could explain some of the major deluges we're seeing worldwide.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too how they talk about the water vapor that was released into the atmosphere because of this eruption, and that because of that it has a warming effect. But as we touched on last time, they seem to largely ignore the fact that yes, there's a lot of water vapor, but there's also still quite a lot of particulates that were released into the atmosphere, which typically has a cooling effect.
Yeah, so I wonder if they're big enough of each, they kind of cancel each other out.
It could be.
Yeah,
that's possible.
Because
but
the sulfur
also, as you point out too, like the extra moisture in the atmosphere may result in deluges. Like it's not even necessarily staying up there that long.
No, and deluges and clouds make it cooler.
Right. Clouds. Clouds
So
reflect
there's a lot
sunlight. It's albedo effect.
There's a lot of oxymorons here. Now, clouds also keep the nighttime warmer in our area.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a multiplicity of effects.
Yeah.
And here we can see Mount St. Helens eruption. That would be one that shot a lot of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, which would have a cooling effect exclusively.
Right.
Now, also, most of this vapor is not up in the ionosphere or up in the mesosphere or something like that. It's the sulfur dioxide up in the stratosphere and maybe even the mesosphere that is causing the albedo effect and causing solar radiation to bounce back into space. So I don't think the water vapor is necessarily up as high as the sulfur dioxide. So in the end, I think it would be the sulfur that causes the most effect, which would be cooling.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
Yeah. So the volcano released an estimated 30 to 60 million tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. This is Tambora in 1814. VEI 7, we've talked about it before, the year without a summer. So 30 to 60 million, I think Hungatunga is only 400,000 tons of sulfur dioxide. So this is Tambora was 120 times more sulfur dioxide.
Yeah.
So way different volcanic eruption.
Yeah.
And then again, the cooling there was only about 3 to 5 C. I mean, it varied depending on geography.
You know, that's interesting too, because it just occurs to me anecdotally, we've heard, and this is completely anecdotal. This is not a scientific study, but we've heard a lot of people talk about how in their areas that overall this summer it's been a lot cooler than normal, despite the media hype claiming it's, the hottest it's been in 120,000 years or whatever. There's a lot of people saying that from different parts of the globe, which is interesting because it does sort of suggest that perhaps there was a cooling effect from Tunga, and maybe we're seeing some of the results of that this summer in the northern hemisphere, that is.
Yep.
Maybe.
Yeah,
I mean, totally anecdotal. So
we're certainly, what happens during major grand solar minima periods where there is volcanic eruptions and low solar activity is, and you can go back to see my videos 8 years ago, or even at the beginning, where I specifically predict that there are going to be large climate extremes, swings, where in summers you're going to have extreme heat waves with large swaths of area well below normal, which we're seeing now. In the winter, you're going to have the same thing. Areas that typically receive snow might not get any, but other areas that get snow may get a lot of snow, like unprecedented. And now we just came off of one of the biggest years in the Sierra. They were skiing until the end of August with record depths. And the drought in the whole state of California that the alarmists said would never end is over. There is no extreme drought anywhere in California as of this point, especially after Hillary went through and erased 30,000 of her emails. Now, what we should expect this winter, because it is going to be, it's going to be brutal. We've got all this extra moisture up in the atmosphere from Hungatunga. We are coming off of a record snow year, and it's an El Nino year, which is going to make it snow maybe even harder in these mountainous areas.
You know, I I was just reminded, just very briefly, going back to the Silly Penguin article, there's a paragraph in there where they're quoting a scientist who's basically acknowledging the large effect of things like La Nina, El Nino cycles, all of that. And then is like, but the climate models say something else. It's a freaking model. It's not real world data. Like, why would that supersede the actual real world data we have of things like La Nina and El Nino?
Well, he should be saying, but because of my funding source, anthropogenic global warming.
Right. That's the correct translation.
Now, a paper coming out 5 days ago, major Atlantic volcanic activity was a major driver of climate change 56 million years ago, is a great example of how you get global warming dollars, or in this case, anthropogenic global warming dollars, or now climate change dollars. You just rehash an old study about something volcanic where you have some kind of data, proxy data, where you can extrapolate temperature on Earth, and you say that you're using this study to determine how bad humans' effects on climate will be. Because these volcanoes belched out CO2. At the same time, there was a localized warming event. But if you read through the gobbledygook here, it has all kinds of caveats saying that, well, even though we think this, it may not be that. And I mean, it's garbage science. Did you have a chance to look at this?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest problem with this is that they inherently and automatically, assumptively link temperature to CO2. And as we have talked about many times here, there is no association between temperature and CO2. If you look at a modern graph of, like this, oh, this isn't even modern, this is old, temperature leads CO2. CO2 does not lead temperature. So CO2 cannot be the cause of temperature rise. We've looked at some other graphs too, like, looking at the other eras of geological history where sometimes there almost seems to be an inverse relationship, but this is a bit more general. Overall, the overall trend is that temperature leads.
Yeah, this is the clearest example from the ice core data is 237 years ago, 237,000 years before present, which is right in the middle of the ice core data. And so they use this example because it sets an average. The average, when they averaged the whole ice core, there was about an 800-year lag. And at this spot in the ice core data, it shows exactly two peaks 800 years apart. So it's great to use for this because it explains the general physics of CO2 on the planet, how insignificant humans' contribution to CO2 are. And I think it's important that we explain this. But first, I have to cough. So what's happening here? First of all, let me explain that carbon dioxide is just 0.04% of the atmosphere. It's almost nothing. It's negligible. But, and 80% or more of that is released by the oceans, not by humans. I think humans account for like 5% of total 0.04%. which is
It is,
nothing.
I think it's actually 3% of the
Okay.
0.04%.
So
I just saw that
3% of the
number
0.04% is humans, and let's say 97% is the ocean.
Or you could
Does that
say
make- is that-
like, 80% is the ocean and the other, roughly 20% is plants, trees.
Well, plants are greening the earth.
Oh,
so
no, I'm sorry,
the
they're eating
actual
CO2.
carbon budget, I think they're taking out more CO2 than they're adding. So they're actually just sucking it out. But the majority of CO2 is released into our atmosphere with the ocean. So let's do a very general physics class here. Take a look at the temperature line. As the temperature's rising, the oceans are heating. It takes a long time to heat oceans. So even as the temperature's dropping, the oceans continue to heat because there's circulations, oceans are miles deep, and the oceans retain the latent heat from the surface warming for hundreds of years. And that's exactly what we see in this. Even after the temperature starts dropping on the surface, the oceans are still warm and they continue to release CO2 because warm oceans release CO2. And it takes 800 years until the oceans get cool enough that they start capturing it again. This is proof 100% that the temperature controls the CO2.
Yeah. Yes. So just based on that alone, this particular study is complete garbage because it is all of it is entirely based on the idea that CO2 increases temperature. So it's just complete garbage. And by the way, this I find very funny. They have this in the article that describes the study on phys.org. They have this little sentence here that says hypotheses for the cause of this hyperthermal, and then they put in parentheses, short-lived warming. Well, what they're referring to is a warm period that's 200,000 years long. So they're calling that short-lived warming. And we're concerned about like the last 20 years of the most minuscule temperature rise. Are you kidding me?
Wow.
It's like hilarious. Like get some perspective, like check your head. It's bizarre. But of course, like always, this is always about funding, as you rightly point out.
Right. And there's over a dozen scientists on this paper, and not one of them is an expert in CO2 and how it warms the earth, because they could have done a whole chapter on that, which they do not. This paper assumes, well, the problem is the whole assumption of the IPCC and the term climate science. They don't need to have a reference on how CO2 warms the earth because none exists.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you imagine being a scientist that writes, that contributes to crappy studies like this? And like, I don't know, how can you not be aware on some level that you're spouting BS and that you're lying and it's all for funding? And then you continue to do this throughout your career. Like, how do you, it's not just how do you live with yourself, but your entire career is completely fake. Like, how do you live like that? I don't get it. The lack of integrity is mind-boggling.
Well, if you're towards the end of your career, your tenure, and you only have 5, 10, even 15 years left, maybe to retire, there you have a huge dilemma. There's not enough time to delve into a different topic or something. When you're already an expert in something that's been disproven, you just put the blinders on and you keep moving forward as the disproven expert.
Yeah, I mean, it's like what I was saying last week about this happens all the time with career scientists, right? Somebody comes along with a much better theory to explain something that what you have, and it blows your theory out of the water. And now your career, you've spent decades working on a particular topic, is now destroyed. So what do? You concede? No, probably most people just, start poo-pooing that person or vilifying them or whatever. And this happens all the time. They try to blacklist the scientist that has the theory that's better than theirs, which is just gross. Like,
well,
talk about
and that leads us back to the whole concept of paradigm shift. Paradigm shifts in science typically take a generation, which is 3 decades at minimum, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So even though there may be, like, say, a lot of scientists leaning towards plasma cosmology or electric universe, including, I think, as early as 2008, the professional society IEEE changed over from the standard model to plasma cosmology.
Yeah.
It's not in textbooks, and it won't be until way after we're gone.
Right. Yep. I mean, I have, at the risk of this being heard, I guess, but I've talked to you sometimes about, when we got interested in electric universe theory a long time ago, and, we noticed that the IEEE did, ultimately recognize it. And then we were having a conversation with my father, right? My father is an electrical engineer, and sort of introduced all of the concepts of this to him. But, here he is. He spent his entire life, believing the sort of mainstream typical science, the things that you learn in college, et cetera. And like, he just couldn't swallow it,
It takes time. Time takes time.
Yep.
Another great show. Thank you guys for coming. Be safe.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. And we'll be right back after this message.
Hello, my name is Mr. Rowe.